Good to see you guys. We tend to talk to each other and see each other on a regular basis for a lot of different reasons, but now we're on a podcast together. I think this is the first time the four of us have been on the same podcast. So welcome. Hope you guys are doing well. We're going to be talking about a bunch of things, mostly focusing around SIMM, right? And these are things that are, of course, dear to our heart and core to our business. And it's something that we always keep our tabs on, our focus on, and mainly around the changes that happen from a regulator perspective, from a client perspective, and kind of navigating what clients are requesting from us and need from us as some of these changes happen with SIMM and some of the challenges that are posed. And we've done quite a bit of work over the past year, kind of looking at this. I think one of the first things that, and this goes back a year ago. It's more than a year. Hey, Stuart, what I'm referencing is the letter that the PRA had put out on the review of SIMM and the use of SIMM in terms of its inadequacy, its potential to not cover 99% confidence, and the fact that it wasn't nimble enough, and that was based on observations from some market stresses, Archegos, and a few other things that happened in the past. It was it's pretty interesting to see that they were criticizing it, because I think SIMM, initially SIMM was built to be non-procyclical and more conservative so that they cover everything, and again, kind of like a blunt tool to do that. But we have been looking at this for the past year, and then there's been a lot of reaction to it from the market and from ISDA. But why don't we just dive into this a little bit and have a bit of a conversation around the letter?
It's worth taking a little step back from how it's described and how it's often viewed from the industry. And I think, phase 6 just gone live. I think there was a feeling of celebration of kind of, we've achieved something quite stunning, and no one could have imagined it would have gone this well, only to then have a regulator throw out what felt like quite a bit of criticism at a time of kind of joy, effectively, in the industry. And I think you've got to take a step back and think about what's the PRA's role and how do they tend to manage financial risk, and how is it maybe different to some other regulators? And the fact that they tend not to get too involved. They tend to just push it back to the firms and ask the firms, are you doing all these things? Because we're a little bit worried you might not be. And I think when you read it with that context, it reads a bit more of a criticism of firms using SIMM than of SIMM itself. And that I don't think there was ever any doubt that there was enough tools within SIMM to make it work. The question was whether firms were using those tools adequately, or whether they were overly relying on ISDA to do some of the parts that were always their problem. So that the application of add-ons being a key one. Were firms actively doing that, or were they simply sitting back waiting for ISDA to tell them there's a problem and we'll fix it, which then begat the problem that it's quite slow. So yeah, I think it's worth just keeping in mind that all the criticisms were largely leveled at the financial institutions themselves, as opposed to the mechanism. And that, again, the letter's obviously addressed to the financial institutions, again, because of how sort of the PRA is set up and how it's told to manage the firms.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think some of the initial reactions were like, "Oh, this is directed towards ISDA," but yeah, the letter was addressed to risk managers at all of the tier 1 banks, right?
I mean, even on the point of parameters, this is something we're tracking all the time. How people are using our products, what people are submitting, are the things we need to modify accordingly, even off the back of a comment from the PRA. But on the point of parameters, we track this, and there's not really a lot of people in our system using them. And we're not even talking phase 5, phase 6. We're talking the largest clients in the world, tier 1, 2, 3 banks. People are not using these. So it's kind of it's a little bit of evidence that there needs a bit of learning, kind of teaching, and more proactive approach instead of waiting for ISDA, like you were saying, Stuart, to fix things.
I mean, you think it was like a perception? It was more perception than anything else, or do you really feel like the PRA, because there was some controversy going back and forth in terms of whether or not they should write this letter, but I think there was a lot of conversations that happened after the letter, and it seemed to me that the industry started working again. The industry is always working closely with all the global regulators on, the yearly back test and the quarterlies and the recalibrations that happen once a year, to ensure that it's covering risk, and that they're adjusting asset classes accordingly based off of historical P&L, et cetera. But Scott, maybe I know you talk to a ton of regional banks in the US. Has anything, I know this is really focused in on Europe and the UK. But from your conversations, has this come up a lot in some of your conversations with clients here in the US, or not really?
Yeah, even I'd say well before the PRA letter was issued, the industry had its first test of a stress period that was not included in the SIM calibration when COVID hit in spring 2020. And at the time, John, if you remember, we actually co-published an article taking data and looking at the backtesting performance of SIM over that COVID stress period, even while those market parameters were not included in the SIM calibration. And we actually saw, even with the just 2008, 2009 as the lone stress period in SIM still performed very admirably through everything we've seen from our client run backtest and some of the industry data that we're able to gather and apply against SIM from a backtesting perspective. Now that the COVID stress period is included in the SIM calibration, we continue to see SIM perform even more admirably from a quantitative perspective. We're running many different back tests for clients on a quarterly basis, and I'd say it's actually quite rare to see amber and red exceedances in aggregate. So we still continue to see quantitatively SIM performing quite well. I think from my perspective, a lot of the criticisms that I focused on from the PRA letter came primarily from making sure that you have flexibility to be able to perform back testing over recent periods. And one criticism in particular, the limitations of only performing in-sample back testing. So if you're only back testing over a historical horizon that is exactly equal to the SIM calibration horizon, you may be missing some more recent market volatility that could affect your portfolio, even if the SIM calibration has a bit of a lag to it. So oftentimes there's a 6 to 9 month period of time of more recent data that's not included in the SIM calibration that you should, in theory, be able to calculate P&Ls on and apply backtesting to, so that you can perform both an in-sample and an out-of-sample backtest if you want to, and understand where some of those differences may be arising.
Yeah, I think the regulators did feel like there was a blind spot. Look, I think really timing is essential here, because I think they probably knew about these things. The regulators may have known about some of these blind spots ahead of time, but we were in the midst of phase in periods. I think it was the right time to kind of take a step back and say, look, this model, it's, again, like kind of what you're saying and what Stuart was saying, it's not really the model. The model is performing as designed. It's more of, like you said, is it flexible enough? Are you looking at enough data or enough time periods to make those adjustments to ensure that you're covering the risk, et cetera? And I think that's what it's been laid out. I'm still wondering if there's more to come, though, from the regulators. I do know that the WGMR, which is the kind of the governance body in BCBSI OSCO, who created the global framework, is continuing to meet still. And I know they're looking at a lot of different things. I think this is probably one of those things. I'm curious and looking to see if there's going to be anything else that comes out of this. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts or heard anything on that.
My perspective on, just continuing to focus a little bit more on that PRA letter, they were essentially asking the large banks to be able to model the performance of SIM on behalf of their buy-side counterparties in phases 5 and 6. And there was almost this assumption that, especially outside of the US and in other places, there's not yet a regulatory requirement for those counterparties to need to do backtesting and benchmarking like the big banks need to do as part of a regulatory requirement. So it was almost a soft push to kind of cover that potential blind spot and make sure that you have from our perspective, three kind of foundational pillars of SIM performance monitoring on a quarterly basis, making sure you can back test your model, making sure you can benchmark it against alternative value at risk style models, and making sure that you can identify and quantify any risks that you know are not captured by SIM, and that you can account for those if they're material by way of add-ons or multipliers against that SIM output. So that we know that those three pillars are foundational for the large banks. And even if there's not a strict regulatory requirement on the buy side for phases 5 and 6, they should consider thinking about maintaining the tools and just as part of their prudent internal model risk management process, thinking about how they can apply those tools on their own side as a way to monitor the performance of SIM for them individually.
And it's interesting you say, Scott, that, you know, looking at multiple tools to monitor it, there's always been this kind of geographic tension between the static backtest and the dynamic backtest, with the States very much proponents of the static one and European more in favor of the dynamic backtest. I think the argument that they both are separate and serve different purposes and complement each other is getting stronger in time. You know, the static backtest is a once-off high statistical power to give you that analysis. It's analyzable, it's very useful, especially in the recalibration period. But then the dynamic backtest for daily monitoring and the capturing of risks not in SIM, and also the capturing of other issues like the non-modelable risk factors, is pretty powerful, especially when it's used with front office P&L. So I think the acceptance that maybe you need to run both of those and you need to use them in different ways at different times to give you a proper governance process across the board is coming to, I think, fruition. I'm sure we'll talk more about the RTS in a minute, but I think very much how the RTS is laid out, looking at static for a setup and a recalibration, and then dynamic for monitoring, that fast response time being a key part of that.
And a concentration of smaller phase 5 and 6 counterparties in other asset classes that may not be as well captured by SIM in particular. I think commodities were highlighted as a potential very, very high volatility asset class, especially recently. The only real way to know and quantify and identify these risks not in SIM is generally through a robust internal model validation process, where you force the model owner internally to document and justify and quantify some of those potential model gaps. And rightly so, there's concern that there's not generally an independent model validation team at some of these smaller counterparties, especially on the buy side. So making sure that you could at least have your dealer counterparties cover that, or potentially, you know, nudge some of those smaller counterparties to consider some of these bank-like model governance features like validation and backtesting and benchmarking. I think it would do the industry a real big solid if everyone is thinking about prudent risk management, even without a strict regulatory requirement to do so.
Yeah, and I think that was the industry's concern too, Scott. Stuart's mentioned the RTS, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I think, too. But you know, the smaller firms who do not have that level of model governance or the understanding or the expertise to do it was kind of the big advocacy point in Europe anyway for easing the requirements for firms to have to backtest, but they face a conundrum because of exactly what you're saying. I think the big problem that I see on the European side is that you have a collect requirement, and if you're collecting and using a model, you really need to know how it's performing, and you need to be able to test that model somehow, some way. And I think the RTS prescribed that. Now things have been evolving a little bit on that front. Some positive, some, you know, depending on how you look at it, some negative. But we'll see. I don't think the story has been written yet. And I think it will continue to move along. But what we're talking about specifically is the IM model validation. Obviously, we're talking about SIM today. So can you just quickly explain like where we are on that? You know, I can kind of fill in a little bit on what I know from an industry perspective, because I think it's important in this context that we're talking about it, because they all fit together, right?
Yeah. So we talked a bit at the start about the PRA and the UK landscape. Obviously slightly different in Europe, all the different member states, all the different regulators, but all sitting within one, European community, needing some level of consistency across what it is that they do. And I think the European Union, therefore, specifically felt the need to write a more prescribed guidance as to how to implement SIM and how to implement the model governance of SIM than maybe other regions did, where they were dealing with a single regulator in a single region. So here we have a very detailed and extremely well-written guide of how to implement, validate, and ongoingly monitor SIM to make sure that it delivers against the requirements, your underlying requirements you have for the 99% holding and pledging. And I think, extremely well done, separated out into effectively a larger institution or a dealer side and a smaller institution and a client side with different requirements for both. One obviously being a sort of a downgraded version of the other one. I think some interesting things came out, whereas previously
they call it simpler.
Yeah.
Not down. Whether it's simple or not, I don't know if that was the right word, but the point of that was they heard, the EBA listened to the industry and said, look, you have to make this a little bit more simpler or less arduous than what the tier one banks had. So that was kind of the distinction between phases 1 through 4 and then 5 and 6. And they painted that very nicely, and they have quite a bit of detail in terms of what the requirements were.
I think really capturing exactly what are the backtesting and monitoring requirements and how they differ between those two groups, but then also clarifying the use of outsourcing and the use of vendors and the use of consultants to support you through that, an acknowledgement that a lot of these firms, again, are just not going to have standing teams who can pick up these things and run with them. They're going to need to use an awful lot of consultants, an awful lot of vendor support to take them through the conclusion of this. But there's still we always said SIM was going to be a big uplift for firms who were going to have to do a risk calculation, albeit a pretty simple one, every day, probably for the first time. And similarly, this is another set of requirements which are a substantial lift compared to what probably a lot of these buy-side firms are used to, around model validation, around ongoing monitoring, around analysis and interpretation of issues when they come up. There's an awful lot in there which is non-standard and probably completely new to a lot of firms. There's going to be a lot of learning to happen if this thing finally does get passed into European law, and an awful big step up for a lot of those firms. One of the things we've certainly seen is a reluctance to invest and make decisions in buy-side firms until they've seen what the conclusion of this is going to be. They often have to have some process, but it will be limited and relatively, focused on what they're doing. And then they'll sit and wait for clarification on what it is they need to do next. So in many ways, the delays are kind of hurting just that natural progression that people would do anyway, knowing they need to be model owners now. And we're not necessarily seeing that while everybody waits to see if it's going to be this very prescriptive form or whether there's going to be a lesser form that they can adopt instead.
Makes me think of the simple version. It could be probably spelled SIMM. PLE, but I did want to say how
that's good. You should put a little trademark on that.
I might run into some copyright issues with this stuff, but I did just want to comment on the idea of pushing some of that use of whether it's backtesting or monitoring or in any case of looking at SIM kind of day to day, whether using a vendor or not. I think the welcomed nice layout of the RTS to at least push these firms to learn about the model would be a welcomed kind of new approach, at least for what Acadia sees as a market utility, where we're always getting these clients that, no fault to them, they came live, they had to start margining, and they are now using kind of this model to calculate exposure that they've really never heard of. And there's kind of two approaches. They might use the simpler of the two, or they could use the more complicated SIM approach. But in either case, they're usually very, very unaware of what they're even doing. And they tend to ask us, because again, as we see a lot of these clients day to day, they ask us these very simple questions that just prove that there was no learning process at all. And again, it's just kind of that downstream effect of firms are not really going to put in those resources or that learning time unless there's a regulatory requirement.
Yeah, I think those are all valid points. I mean, from my simple perspective, I always looked at it like, and again, I keep going back to unless the regulators in Europe change and mirror the U.S. In terms of the collect and post requirements on the swap dealer community only, you're faced with this conundrum, right, of ownership. Like Stuart, you're saying, like you're owning the model, and when you do that, you're responsible for it, how it's performing in your portfolios, and all portfolios are different. And you really need a good, robust process in order to look at it. And there are options out there. And I'm not, we're not here to just sell our products, but yeah, we get tons of questions. Yeah, there's been, there's yearly recalibrations, and we'll get into the off-cycle recalibrations in a minute. But it's ever changing. But I think going back to the RTS, for me anyway, and I do talk to the regulators directly from time to time. Clarity is essential. Leaving firms, especially the phase 5 and 6 firms, the funds that are out there that aren't sure what they need to do or what they're required to do, that needs to be solved soon. That cannot linger out too long, because the whole point of these regulations is to provide standards and clarity. And thankfully, things are pretty much working well or as designed. And I think biasly, we're the market's very lucky that a firm like Acadia is out there. But yeah, of course, there's other solutions out there as well. But we have a really deep bench of experts that are helping firms out with all these questions. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how this plays out in Europe. And I know it has to go through a lot of different committees and parliament, et cetera, to finalize this. But we'll see.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when the UMR regulations were first proposed and implemented globally, it was thought to be a disincentive for trading in the non-cleared markets, because there was all this additional funding and capital cost of raising this additional margin. I think we've been surprised and I'd say quite happy overall, given our focus in the non-cleared space, of the resilience of the non-cleared market. And over the last several years, there's been a very clear upward trajectory in trade volumes flowing through our system. So I definitely feel quite strongly like that the non-cleared market is not going anywhere, and it continues to be and serve a vital industry purpose, especially from a hedging perspective. So it's just another check mark in the potential pro column of an alternative model that is potentially a bit less conservative.
I think the beginning of that more sharp object was the off-cycle recalibration, and that was an attempt to try and bring some of these risks or a model that is potentially has a very wide curve to it, maybe a little more fine-tuned to what the current market environment is. But that also brings a few more operational burdens, right? Where these larger clients that started in 2016, 2017 are able to very easily just kind of plug in different models and test what's going on. Is there going to be a huge impact if there's a new model in the next 3 months as opposed to the next 9 months?
And one other thing to keep in mind in the initial margin space is SIM is not the only model being used, right? A lot of these large dealers have their own internal house IA models where they often apply a higher of the house IA margin compared to the SIM margin and the counterparty, and the counterparty posts the higher of. So there are already multiple models being employed across the industry from an initial margin perspective. I think sometimes it's not as widely talked about as SIM is globally.
Yeah, it's an interesting that's an interesting insight, Scott. I don't think that many people really think about that. Obviously, if you're posting higher of, you're not breaching any regulations. But yeah, there are several models out there that banks have created over time, and VAR models that have been around for a very, very long time, that are still being used and will continue to be used, right? And probably refined. Jake, you mentioned off-cycle recalibrations, and we wanted to talk a little bit about that. We did just have one, and I think you're right. It's probably the first step in addressing um, the recommendations that came out of the PRA, and we'll probably see more. And we already had, we just had the first off-cycle recalibration, which was 2.5A, right? That came over in July. From I'll go to you first, Jake. Like from your perspective, how did that change from your day-to-day work and what you've been, how you've been interacting with clients? And then we can go around the horn. We can kind of give a background of what that is as well. But I think a lot of people who are maybe listening to this understand that, recalibrations were yearly. Now they can be quarterly. But what there's also kind of recently put together a new off-cycle recalibration schedule that we can get into a little bit. But Jake, what have you seen? We just came through one. So any interesting observations based off of that?
Yeah, I mean, so 2.5A that just came live didn't really change much outside of kind of a few of the interest rate related risk weightings of SIM. So it wasn't a major change, thank goodness. But I will say, I kind of keep harping back to this, but the whole education and knowledge of SIM, it was a little evident where we typically see on the annual recalibrations, people are usually ready. I mean, people, they attend a working group. They know that the date in December is going to come when they have to use the new model for 2.5A. There definitely was probably double or triple the number of questions asking of why did my exposure change from the prior day? And there were in some cases there were clients, we ran it through our system and we calculated on our side it was this. Why are you seeing this? And then there was some teaching there to be done that 2.5A was being used instead of 2.5. So I think it further stresses the need for some education, and Acadia tries to put in the grunt work there. We try and teach our clients about that. But I think, thank goodness, it wasn't a major recalibration. I think there could have been some more damage there had this been a larger change.
Yeah, and I think there's some onus, I think, on firms as well to provide people with better visibility of what's coming up. Forcing every firm across the world, over 400 firms now using SIM, it's probably closer to 500 firms implementing a new SIM model every 6 months or so, so they can do an impact analysis. Makes very little sense, and it's not an efficient way for the world to kind of use its quant resources. Much better, I think, that vendor firms like Acadia do that more for the industry, that we run those impact analysis, we do it centralized, we do it more efficiently and effectively, and give people easier tools so they're not taken by surprise in the worst case, or blindsided by last minute things that come up. They don't have time to do the full impact analysis they might like, or just the inevitable mistakes that happen in 500 firms implementing 500 different models across the globe to try and do those impact analysis. Somewhere I think vendors can add a lot of value.
Yeah, I agree. I think the off-cycle recalibration was necessary based off of some of the conclusions that the PRA and even other regulators have come to realize. And I think, and we are not sure what this next year is going to look like, because I think what is this proposal is to have two set recalibrations per year going into 2025, I believe. But in between now and then, there could potentially be more off-cycle recalibrations. And yeah, firms really want to know what that looks like. Jake, you said, thankfully it wasn't a huge impact. Most of it was interest rate related, but the next market shock, if there's a 40% drop in the S&P, you're going to assume that equities will be touched and maybe other asset classes, because sometimes they follow each other. But you're right. I mean, I think we play that essential role in helping firms really understand and get ahead of it. You need to do that, right? For funding, for liquidity management. These are things that are necessary. The off-cycle recalibrations are necessary, but what comes with it is you need to be prepared to understand the impact of it, right? Just being ready to calculate, a 2.6A or 2.7A or B is probably not enough. What if your exposure amounts are 3x or something to that level?
And you don't want to be the collateral manager turning up at the Treasury Department on the Monday saying,
right.
By the way, have you got 500 million that you could just post?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we didn't do an
They could have
impact
known about
analysis.
that. Yeah. They could have known about it for 2-3 weeks before that.
Yeah. So I think that's essential. I think it's very, very essential to have that impact analysis. It's almost interesting to me that the industry hasn't really, like through ISDA. When I say the industry, I don't mean our clients' industry, but like industry bodies haven't been talking more about that.
Like Stuart was saying, using quantitative resources for that is probably not the smartest use of those resources if you can just simply, use a solution to see how that's going to be impacted. But
yeah, I think people are all like, especially now, all the conversations we have around budgeting for resources, everything's getting squeezed and squeezed. People just want, especially if they can leverage something that exists already, right? If you could exist a CRIF file that you're already producing or anything of that nature that could easily plug and play, and you can get kind of a user interface that shows what the impact is very simply. I think people would applaud that. And that's what we're trying to do, right? And I don't think, what we do know is that nothing's ever set in stone. I think this is the plan right now. I think the off-cycle recalibration plan is what we have in front of us, but I don't think by any means that we could just say that's how it's going to be now for the next 5 years. All it takes is a giant, market stress event to change all of that, right? And we've seen that through COVID. We've seen that through the Ukraine war, the dash for cash, et cetera. That what never changes is those things happening. If you've been around this industry long enough, you've seen quite a few of those. So that's, we shall see.
I guess the only thing I'd add is I hear it from both sides, people who look at it and go, this 23-month period you can have between event and model recalibrations ridiculous. And conversely, talking to people who are in the governance group saying, actually, it's going to be quite a lift to get to a biannual recalibration. There's a lot of work that goes on that probably isn't widely seen outside that governance group, a lot of data that goes backwards and forwards, a lot of models that get updated and backtests that get rerun. That is going to be quite a lift for some of the banks who are in that governance group to move up to that biannual process, and data quality is going to have to improve around that. So yeah, it seems obvious and easy to say we should update the frequency of model recalibration. But when you're not dealing with a single entity, when you're dealing with a large governance group from across the globe, it's non-trivial for them to change that frequency and increase the cadence.
And John, I think it also just continues to echo the benefit of having a robust backtesting process, especially a daily monitoring dynamic backtesting style process or toolkit where you can in near real time know when you have recent market volatility that leads to things like SIMM model breaches and potential add-ons or multipliers against that margin amount. It allows the industry to remain robust and protect against large scale systemic risk if not only just the dealers but their buy-side counterparties or smaller phases 5 and 6 facing one another, if they have the data and the results from those kind of intra-quarter backtests to justify potentially higher margin amounts if there's a large material lag in the way that the SIMM model is calibrated.
It's that extra visibility. I mean, this is a, SIMM is a transparent model, but adding these tools make it even more transparent. And, if you're a fiduciary, I couldn't see why you wouldn't use this if you're on the fund side. I mean, I spent 6 years on the buy side working for a large quant hedge fund. it is just part of the day to day. It usually is. This is no different, and I completely agree with you, Scott. I mean, I think it'll continue to evolve. I think people will continue to be more aware of the value of what those backtesting services that we have can do for them, right? It doesn't have to be a huge heavy lift.
And even if they don't want to or don't want to consider working with Acadia to provide that on an outsourced basis, a lot of times, especially on the buy side, the daily P&L, 1 day or 10 day, that P&L is their Bible at the end of every day.
That's right.
And sometimes I know there could be kind of modeling differences or different sort of cash flows that could or could not be included in that P&L versus SIM, but a lot of times it's easier than you'd think to connect those P&Ls into comparing that against a day over day SIM. Backtesting in that sense is quite simple, comparing two numbers and counting when one exceeds the other. We of course can do that for you, and sometimes the static backtest is a little bit more complicated with more lengthy historical market data required, but at least in terms of daily ongoing monitoring, it should be part of everyone's toolkit regardless of the local regulatory requirements for each firm.
Yeah. I mean, we're all preaching to the choir here, but just taking a step back and just kind of looking at it from that perspective. Yeah, I totally agree. Guys, any final words? I know we've covered quite a bit. I think really what we're saying here is, as always, and I use this term, watch this space all the time, but it's true. This will continue to evolve. We're very curious and hopeful about a bunch of things. The RTS that we discussed, the IM validation RTS, how that's going to shake out, how these off-cycle recalibrations are going to impact our clients. Obviously, we're always here, and we're again, I'm singing our praises, but it is true. We have our fingers on the pulse of all this stuff, and we're constantly thinking about how we can serve our clients, and it's just what we do.
One thing to add, John, I know the last 10 years, Acadia has done a great job serving as the community leader in the initial margin space. I think I'm quite excited personally after Acadia's recent acquisition by LSEG earlier this year, being part of the broader London Stock Exchange Group post-trade division. I think there's lots more tools, especially in the optimization space. So we talked earlier about potentially alternative models to reduce the amount of initial margin outstanding, but there's also lots of other clever methodologies you can apply for kind of network-wide risk and trade compression to reduce the amount of margin, not only your own margin, but the entire kind of trading network's margin outstanding. And a sister company of ours, Quantile, within LSEG's post-trade division, specializes that. And I think there's some real powerful connections being made now within the broader LSEG universe to enable lots of optimization and other clever initiatives that can benefit the entire, not only non-cleared industry, but even connecting the non-cleared derivative space over to the cleared space and providing risk and margin and capital efficiencies for the entire derivatives community.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of new and exciting things that are going to happen. I think there's going to be a lot of unique services that are going to come out of that. We didn't really get into the details of the LSEG acquisition of Acadia, but you touched on a bunch of those things just now, Scott. Maybe there's another podcast that we can kind of focus in on that. And I think it's just exciting. It's really exciting.
One of the really interesting things that came out of the widespread use of IMEM is just, me and Jake complain about it, but the quality of data that's actually in IMEM is incredibly high. The ability for firms to reconcile against each other at sensitivity level. There's always going to be places where it doesn't work and doesn't match, but it has driven a level of data quality I think you don't get from other maybe central repositories of that type of data. And it's interesting to see how you could take that kind of model and make it work elsewhere and take some of that reconciliation, the hard work that goes in from analysts all over firms across the world to get that data quality that high. How can we leverage that in other places and bring some of those benefits elsewhere? And when you have better quality data, then things like optimization, I think there's been some work done on the effectiveness of optimization as the quality of the data on the input side improves, and it goes up dramatically. So there's other things that's really interesting, how we can take what we've learned in IEM and apply it elsewhere, and then bring maybe what aren't obvious benefits, but are adjacent benefits back to people through that kind of higher quality data that you're able to provide.
It's equivalent to everybody kind of knowing the same language. And now that everybody's kind of at like a very, very basic understanding, we can get now to the fun, more complex areas.
All right, guys. Well, this was fun. It was great seeing you all. I'm surprised we didn't mention AI or ChatGPT at all during this. I know I'm saying it now, but we're at the end. Maybe we'll see what that's, if Microsoft and OpenAI have any solutions that might be able to help the industry as well. Anyway, it was great seeing you guys. I thought there'll be more of this. There's always more to come. And I'm sure we'll probably have another podcast to discuss the next iterations of everything we've talked about today. So thank you very much. And thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.